Okay, now that we've got the data in the database, we don't want to return our data like this. We'd rather return a single class that has all the properties flattened for the auction and the item as well. So let's just clear up the stuff at the top of this screen. And if we head over to the spec sheet, let's take a look at what we are supposed to return from our endpoints in terms of an auction DTO. And effectively, this is just the auction and the item mostly combined, but returning things like the status as a string instead of the enum value, which is going to be an integer. And what else do we have? Okay, that looks fine, but it's really just an object that's been flattened into a single object from two objects, and that's how we're going to shape our data to return. And we're going to use DTOs to do that, so data transfer object, so that we can go from our auction and item entity into an auction DTO. And inside the auction service, we'll create a new folder and call it DTOs. And inside the DTOs, we're going to add a new file that's going to be a class called auction DTO. And once again, I'm just going to update the namespace to DTOs. And inside here, we're effectively going to have a combination of the auction and item entities. So I'm just going to go to the auction.cs first of all. I'm just going to copy all of the properties apart from the item into my clipboard and paste them into the auction DTO. And the status here, we're going to swap from the status enum to a string, as we want to return the value of the enum, not the database value, which was just an integer. And let's see, we can remove the optional properties here as well, as this is just a thing that we're returning, and we'll remove the default values from this as well. We don't want default values in our DTOs. A DTO really just should be a collection of properties, effectively. And that looks good, and we'll just go to our item. And we don't need the ID of the item, but we'll copy the properties of the car, and we'll also go to our auction DTO and paste those in as well. And that looks good. Also, so that we can create an auction, we'll need the properties that we require from the user when they attempt to create an auction, and we'll do that via a DTO. So we'll create another new class, and we'll call this one create auction DTO. And inside here, we're going to need several properties, car-related properties. So I'm just going to go to the auction DTO and copy the properties that we're going to take from the user, which is going to be the make, model, the year, the color, the mileage, the image URL. And we'll put that inside here. And we also need to get from them what they want the reserve price to be, the minimum amounts that their car could be sold for. So we'll specify reserve price. And we'll also have the int or the date time for the auction end. Now we want to make all of these properties required. We don't want auctions in our database that do not have any of these properties. And we'll make them explicitly state if they don't want a reserve price, we want them to specify that's going to be 0. So if somebody puts in $1 for their bid, then that's what the price would have to be sold at. So it's down to the user what they want for this, whether or not they want the reserve price. But we are going to make all of these fields required in here, and we can use data annotations to do so simply by specifying required in square brackets against each of these individual properties. And I'll just do this for all of these. So we need the color, and we need the mileage, and we need the image URL, and we need the reserve price, and we need the date the auction is going to finish. And we'll create one more DTO inside here if they want to update an auction. So we'll create another new file inside the DTOs folder, another class, and we'll call this one update auction DTO. And we'll just take the properties that we need for the car, just the make, model, year, color, and mileage. We won't let them adjust the image URL, just 5 properties in this case. And we'll go to our update auction DTO and paste those in there. And I'm just going to check that I've got the namespace for each of these classes I've added, because I've probably forgotten one. I have the create auction. Let's just put this inside the DTOs folder as well. If you do forget to do that and you're using the same extension as myself, it's not really a big problem and it'll continue to work fine. So long as you don't use the same name as a class somewhere else in the same namespace, then you won't get any problems. So now we've got the DTOs in place, we need some mapping profiles for Automapper so it can automatically map us from the auction to the auction DTO. Now Automapper is a great tool. It takes a look at the property names. So for example, if we have a property in here called reserve price in the entity and we want Automapper to automatically map something into the auction DTO, so long as it's got the same name as the property, then Automapper will take care of this mapping for us. So it's a really useful tool, and we'll set this up and configure it so it does exactly that. So inside the auction service, I'm going to create another new folder called request helpers, and inside that folder I'm going to create another new class and say add new file. That's going to be a class and call it mapping profiles. And inside this class we need to derive from Automapper, and we're going to use the profile from Automapper that we're going to derive from. So we've got Automapper there, and the namespace, I'm just going to update this as well to request helpers. And inside this class that we derive from profile, we need to create an empty constructor. So I'll do that and remove the parameters. We don't need parameters for this, but then we can go ahead and create our mapping profiles and tell Automapper what we want it to map from and what we want it to map to. So we're going to have a create map going from the auction to the auction DTO. But we also want it to map the item as well. So after this we'll add parentheses and we're going to tell it to include members, and then we're going to say X goes to X dot item. But we also need a mapping. If we're going to ask Automapper to do this, we also need to tell it to go from the item to the auction DTO as well. So we'll create another map below this one, but this time going from item to auction DTO, and we don't need to include members for that one. We'll also create a mapping going from the create auction DTO to the auction. And because we've got car properties in here, we'll need to go from the for member, or item properties I should say. And for this specific member we'll give some configuration properties, and we'll say for member D for destination, which is going to be item. We want to say the options and say O goes to O.map from, and then we'll say S, the source of this is S goes to S dot nothing. In fact just S, because S is the source itself, and we don't want item there, we just want S, which was more difficult than it should be because the IntelliCode seemed to insist on wanting the item there, but S represents item in this case. And because we're also going from create auction DTO to the item as well, we just need a mapping to take care of that. So we'll add another mapping here going from the create auction DTO to the related property, which is item as well. And one more bit of configuration we need to do for Automapper before we move forward is to provide this as a service inside our program class. So let's open up the program.cs, and just underneath our services that we already have, we'll just say builder.services, and we'll say add Automapper, and then we specify the location of where our mapping profiles are. And typically nowadays I just use app domain, current domain, and say get assemblies, which provides the location of effectively the assembly that this application is running in. It's going to take a look for any classes that derive from the profile class and register the mappings in memory so that when it comes to using Automapper, it's already set up and good to go. So now we're all set up, what we'll take a look at next is creating a web API controller so we can start returning data that we retrieve from our database.